My name is Dr. Gary McGowan. I'm a doctor, trainer, and physio here at Triage, and I'm here to talk to you today about heart rate zones. You may have heard people discuss heart rate zones with respect to running training, endurance training, or even cardio training in the gym. The reason these heart rate zones are important is that they give us insight into the energy systems in the body that are contributing to energy metabolism during a given activity. This provides us with information about what fuel substrate we're burning, for example, carbohydrates versus fat, and also the adaptations that we get from training. Finally, the really important part is that it gives us insight into the fatigue that's generated by the activity. Heart rate zones are typically listed from 1 to 5. Zone 1 is often described as being from 50 to 60% of your maximal heart rate. Zone 2 is from 60 to 70, Zone 3, 70 to 80, Zone 4, 80 to 90, and Zone 5 then is 90 to 100% of your maximal heart rate. These of course are somewhat arbitrary, and some people will use different cutoffs, but it is a useful framework for programming endurance training. So before we get into when you should train in different zones, it's important to understand what the zones are signifying. So our maximal heart rate during exercise is often somewhere between 160 to 200 beats per minute. Some people will be a little bit higher and some a little bit lower. There are genetic factors, there are health factors, it changes with age and so on. But for argument's sake, if we take someone that has a maximal heart rate of 200 beats per minute and during an exercise session we observe that 200 beats per minute, that tells us that that person is working at maximal effort. They will not be able to sustain that activity for long because of how close they're working to their max. On the contrary, if someone is walking around during the day at work, for example, their heart rate might be between 30 and 50% of their maximal heart rate. This is far closer to their resting heart rate, and this isn't going to be very fatiguing at all, and therefore it can be sustained for a much longer period of time. So, the lower your heart rate, the longer you can sustain that activity, and thus the lower intensity the activity is, the longer you can sustain it. And this relates primarily to the energy systems that contribute to energy metabolism. So when we exercise, we need to have constant ATP supply, which is the energy currency of the body, in order to keep our muscles working. This goes whether we're lifting weights, running, or even just walking around during the day. We can supply this ATP in a very fast manner or in a very slow manner. A very fast manner, for example, would be local ATP supply. So we do have small amounts of ATP located within muscle cells, or it can be regenerated quite quickly using the creatine phosphate system. This creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine system is the reason that people will supplement with creatine or creatine monohydrate in order to enhance their power and strength outcomes. Because this is a substrate for that phosphocreatine system, allowing for rapid regeneration of ATP for short, sharp, powerful activities. On the other end of the spectrum, we have slow ATP production. This can come from either carbohydrates or fats. Fat metabolism is a bit slower and isn't going to be able to keep up with high intensity activities. Therefore, when we walk around during the day or we do very low intensity cardio, we're more likely to be using fat as a substrate during those activities. As we intensify, we use more and more carbohydrates. So we can have aerobic or slow energy production using carbohydrates or fats. We can then have faster energy production via glycolysis using carbohydrates, and then we can have the fastest energy production using ATP locally within the muscle or regenerating it using creatine phosphate. If we're exercising in, let's say, zone 1 to zone 2, this is primarily an aerobic activity. We're primarily using slower energy systems. And as we do this, we're generating less byproducts of fatigue. Byproducts of fatigue include acidosis, for example. When we work at very high rates and we run glycolysis really quickly, we generate a lot of hydrogen ions or acidosis within the muscle. This can compromise muscle function, which is why we get buffering of this acidosis using buffering molecules such as lactate. This is the reason we see lactate rise during exercise as a buffer for the acidosis generated by fast energy production via glycolysis. So the real problem is that as we move towards the higher energy systems, we have to generate more and more ATP anaerobically using these fast systems, and we get a lot of fatigue along with that. So when we're in zone 1 to zone 2, we're not quite tapping into those stores. We're getting more ATP, but at a slower rate. And this creates a condition where we can sustain this activity for a much longer period of time. For example, you could do 1 to 2 hours of zone 2 cardio without feeling too beat up unless you have very low energy availability. So you're getting a potent aerobic training stimulus without lots of fatigue associated with it. Of course, you will begin to become fatigued, particularly as your volume increases. There are limits to continuing to supply these energy substrates. We can't sustain activity indefinitely, even if we're at these lower heart rate zones. So, for general health purposes, when we're trying to program cardio for someone that's trying to improve their health, improve their energy levels, improve their well-being, we'll spend a lot of our time in and around that zone 2 level. The big benefit of working in and around zone 2 is that you can get the benefits in high volumes, increase your VO2 max, promote health, and do so without totally beating yourself up in the gym. There is still utility, even from a health perspective, to getting into zone 3, 4, 5. And this can be especially time efficient. These are always the trade-offs that you're dealing with. We can do zone 2, get less fatigue, but it's going to take a lot of time. It can often be boring for people. Or we can do intervals where we're dipping into zone 4 and 5, where the workouts are shorter, but also far more difficult in the short term. So from a general health perspective, we recommend a balance of the two. And most of my coaching clients here at Triage would do both the lower intensity and higher intensity cardio. So as a practical application, let's say I have a maximal heart rate of 200 beats per minute, and I want to do 45 minutes of cardio at around zone 2. That will be 60 to 70% of my maximal heart rate, which would be 120 to 140 beats per minute. As I go into zone 3 at 140 to 160, it's not going to be that fatiguing, but we're going to be just nudging towards that point where we have more anaerobic energy metabolism, a bit more fatigue, and a bit more of a physical challenge moment to moment during the workout. Doesn't mean that's a bad thing, you just have to understand this within the context of what you're trying to achieve with your programming. Then what we would do with our intervals, for example, let's say we're getting on the assault bike and we're doing 30 seconds on, 90 seconds off. If I'm doing 30 seconds on, I want to see myself getting towards that zone 5, at least towards the second half of that interval, I would say. So that would mean 180 to 200 beats per minute. But I wouldn't expect to see 200 beats per minute consistently for 30 seconds. That's going to really take it out of me. And what I'd be more inclined to program would be seeing maybe 170 to 180 on the first interval, 180 to 190 on the second interval, and so on, and then maybe dipping into that real high zone 5, 190 to 200 as the intervals progress. So this is how we program cardio in accordance with heart rate zones. Don't get too worked up by it, but knowing these basic practical points can help you to get more from your cardio training, benefiting your health, performance, and body composition. So I've been Dr. Gary McGowan, teaching you here about the importance of heart rate zones for cardio programming. And if you have any more questions about this, of course, feel free to drop them down below. We will have further videos on this topic. So if you have video suggestions, I'd be more than happy to take them from you, and I'll see you in the next video.